I've driven Route 29 countless times, usually late at night when the highway becomes nothing more than a deserted stretch of asphalt slicing through a world devoid of color and life. It's always been a lonely drive, but lately something felt different, almost sinister. I'd heard the stories, local legends whispered in hushed tones at roadside diners, about the gas station, now long demolished, where people once disappeared without a trace. But those were just ghost stories to scare teenagers around campfires, I always thought. That was until one evening when an angry storm churned overhead, lightning crackling like white-hot veins in a bruised sky. Sheets of rain hammered against the windshield as my wipers struggled to keep pace. I was driving cautiously, eyes glued to the barely visible road, when suddenly a figure emerged at the side of the highway. A woman. She was young, drenched, and waving desperately, her hair plastered to her pale face. Instinctively, my foot hovered above the brake, but the memory of those chilling stories froze my muscles. Still, the sheer panic in her expression clawed at my heart, forcing my better judgment aside. I slowed down, pulling over near the spot where the infamous gas station once stood. Lowering the passenger side window slightly, I yelled through the pounding rain. "Do you need help, or?" Her wide eyes met mine, reflecting my headlights like two shimmering mirrors. "My car broke down. I don't have my phone," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please, just let me in. It's not safe out here." A shiver crawled down my spine, the urgency of her voice setting off alarms in my mind. Something felt wrong, dangerously off balance, but could I just abandon her out here? "Where's your car?" I called back, scanning the surroundings but seeing nothing except endless darkness and trees bending in the storm. "It's back there." She gestured vaguely behind her towards the black void. "Please, we have to hurry." Something inside me screamed to hit the accelerator and leave, to never look back. But before I could decide, headlights blazed in my rearview mirror. Another vehicle slowed behind me, bathing us both in blinding white beams. The woman whipped her head around to see, and the look of absolute terror that overtook her face made my blood run cold. "They found me," she whispered, so quietly I barely heard her over the storm. "They're here." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and ran into the woods, disappearing instantly into the wall of rain and shadow. Heart pounding, I sat paralyzed, staring after her, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. The other vehicle idled behind me ominously, its headlights burning like two soulless eyes. Suddenly, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. Startled, I pulled it out and glanced down at the glowing screen. A single message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have stopped." My heart raced violently in my chest, my pulse thrumming against my ears as I stared at the cryptic message on my phone. "You shouldn't have stopped." My hands shook and I nearly dropped the device. How could someone already know where I was or what I'd done? I glanced into the rearview mirror again, the other vehicle still idling behind me, its headlights unwavering. Just as I prepared to shift into gear and speed away, the driver's door of the car behind me slowly opened. A tall figure emerged, silhouetted against the relentless glare of headlights. My breath caught in my throat as the man approached slowly, deliberately, his long coat flapping violently in the storm. "Everything all right?" a deep voice called over the roar of rain, his face obscured by darkness. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to sound calm. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white. "I was just leaving." The stranger took another deliberate step forward, positioning himself near my passenger side window. I tensed, ready to floor the accelerator. "Did she say anything to you?" His voice was calm, but it held a sharpness, an undercurrent of menace. "Who?" I asked, feigning confusion. "The girl you were just talking to," he replied coldly. His tone sent ice flooding through my veins. "You didn't let her in, did you?" Before I could answer, a piercing scream ripped through the storm, raw, desperate, and animalistic. The stranger spun around, startled, his shadow briefly revealing a glint of metal beneath his coat. The scream echoed again, louder, more frantic. Without thinking, I slammed the gas pedal down, tires spinning in the mud, finally finding traction and propelling me forward. As I sped away, my eyes darted to the mirror. The figure had vanished, leaving only the other car sitting abandoned on the shoulder, its headlights fading into the distance. After what felt like hours but had probably only been minutes, I finally spotted a roadside diner, its flickering neon sign promising warmth, safety, and maybe some answers. Still trembling, I pulled into the lot, taking deep breaths to steady my nerves before stepping out into the storm. Inside, the diner was mostly empty, save for a weary-looking waitress and an elderly man sipping coffee at the counter. I took a seat in a cracked vinyl booth, my pulse finally beginning to slow. "Long night?" the waitress asked sympathetically, pouring a steaming cup of coffee without waiting for my response. "Yeah," I murmured, wrapping my chilled fingers around the mug. "You wouldn't believe what just happened." Her eyes flickered with something unsettling, an unreadable emotion dancing across her face. "Route 29?" she whispered, glancing nervously at the old man who had suddenly become very still. I nodded hesitantly, fear beginning to crawl back into my stomach. "You shouldn't have stopped," the old man muttered gravely, never turning to face me. His voice shook slightly, laced with decades of buried dread. "She never lets go once you've seen her." The lights above flickered violently, plunging the diner momentarily into blackness. When they snapped back on, I gasped sharply. Through the rain-streaked window, illuminated by a single sputtering street lamp, stood the girl I'd left behind. Her face was now deathly pale, eyes sunken, expression hollow, almost lifeless. But it was what she was holding in her blood-soaked hands that made my stomach lurch violently. A human head. And as her vacant eyes slowly rose to meet mine, her lips curled into a terrifying smile. My breath froze in my lungs as I stumbled back from the window, knocking the coffee cup from the table. It shattered against the grimy tiles, splashing hot liquid across my legs, but I barely felt it. The girl stood perfectly still beneath the sputtering street lamp, that grotesque smile still frozen on her pale, blood-smeared face. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the waitress's frantic questions. "Do you see her?" I choked, my voice trembling as I pointed to the window. "She's right there!" The waitress turned, her expression shifting from confusion to dread. She moved closer, peering into the darkness. The elderly man at the counter slowly rose, shoulders tense, eyes locked onto mine, filled with sorrow and fear. "There's no one out there," the waitress whispered, glancing back at me nervously. "Who exactly did you see?" "Her, the girl from Route 29, I stammered, my eyes never leaving the figure outside. But now, as I looked again, the girl was gone. Only a dark stain remained on the pavement where she'd stood. My throat tightened. The old man shuffled closer, his cane tapping softly against the tiles. "Did she speak to you?" he asked, voice low and grave. "Yes," I answered breathlessly. "She said someone was after her." He nodded solemnly. "They always say that. The truth is far worse. Who is she?" I asked desperately, grabbing his sleeve in panic. "Tell me what you know." His face darkened. He lowered his voice, leaning close. 20 years ago, young women started vanishing on Route 29, always near that same gas station. The girl you saw tonight, she was the first." My heart stopped. The first? Her car broke down. She waved for help, but no one stopped that night. Her body was found weeks later, deep in the woods. Police never caught who did it. "Then why is she still here?" I asked, fear clawing at my throat. "Is she a ghost?" "She's worse," he muttered, leaning even closer. His voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "Something out there took her, twisted her. She lures others in, playing victim. Once you see her, you're marked. She won't rest until she takes you." The waitress's voice broke in sharply, filled with terror. "You shouldn't be here. You need to go. Now." Before I could respond, the diner's lights snapped off again, plunging us into absolute darkness. The air turned frigid, chilling me to the bone. A soft tapping came from the window, rhythmic and slow. Trembling, I turned my head toward the sound. She stood inches from the glass now, her face distorted and twisted, mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Her dead eyes stared into mine, hunger burning within them. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one bloody finger and drew something on the window, letters dripping red against the glass. "You're next." Suddenly, she slammed her palm against the window, shattering it with explosive force. Shards of glass flew inward, slicing through the air. Screams filled the diner as chaos erupted around me. Cold hands gripped my shoulders, dragging me backward, away from the gaping window. "Run!" the old man shouted, shoving me toward the back door. "She can't leave the highway! Get away now!" I sprinted blindly through the kitchen, bursting out into the pounding rain. My feet slid on mud, breath ragged, heart threatening to burst from my chest. But as I reached my car, panic consumed me. There, on the passenger seat, soaked with blood, was the severed head, its eyes wide open, mouth twisted in agony. And in my rearview mirror, silhouetted by lightning flashes, the girl stood watching, smiling wider than ever before. I stumbled backward from the car, slipping in the mud, rain pelting down mercilessly as thunder shook the ground beneath my feet. My mind reeled, desperate to reject the horrifying sight of that grotesque head in my passenger seat. Its lifeless eyes, wide with terror, seemed to beg me for help I couldn't give. Lightning streaked violently across the sky, illuminating the girl's twisted smile in the mirror once more. Her silhouette flickered, vanished, then reappeared closer, standing impossibly near me now. Her skin was pale and slick with rain and blood, her wet hair clinging like black tendrils to her face. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move, paralyzed by fear. "Please," I whispered weakly, the word barely audible through trembling lips. "What do you want?" Her head tilted grotesquely to one side, as if my question puzzled her. Slowly, unnaturally, she extended her blood-soaked arm, pointing directly toward the dense woods behind the diner. Her mouth stretched wider, the corners splitting into a raw, gaping wound, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Her voice, raspy and cold, whispered through the storm. "Find me." My blood turned to ice, her chilling words reverberating through my bones. As quickly as she'd appeared, lightning flashed again, and the girl vanished, leaving me alone and shaken. My mind swam desperately, struggling to process the nightmare I'd stumbled into. A voice behind me made me jump in panic. I spun around, fists clenched, only to see the elderly man from the diner, his frail body trembling violently, clutching his cane tightly as rain soaked through his clothes. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he croaked, his face pale and haunted. "She chose you now. You're her ticket out of here." "What do you mean?" I shouted, panic rising again. "I didn't ask for this." "No one ever does," he said darkly. "But you're involved now, deeper than you realize. If you want to survive, you'll have to find out what really happened to her, who hurt her all those years ago. She's anchored to this place, trapped between worlds, and every victim she claims brings her closer to escape. How do I stop this?" I begged, desperate and terrified. "There must be a way." He leaned in close, his eyes wide and fearful. "You have to face what's hidden in those woods. That's where it all began. That's where she died." My pulse quickened as I turned toward the shadowed tree line, dark and impenetrable. A maze of secrets waiting just beyond the reach of headlights. Gathering the last remnants of my courage, I slowly began to move toward the forest. Every step felt heavier, my heart hammering like a drumbeat of dread in my chest. Branches snapped and cracked beneath my feet as the rain muffled all sound except my own frantic breathing. I pushed deeper into the woods, guided by some unseen force pulling me relentlessly forward, toward something dark and terrible waiting just ahead. Then, suddenly, the storm went silent. The rain ceased abruptly, leaving me drenched and shivering, surrounded by an eerie stillness. I held my breath, listening carefully. A sickening sound broke the silence, a wet, gnawing crunch, followed by a low, guttural growl. Dread surged through my veins. Slowly, terrified, I turned toward the source. There, crouched low in a clearing illuminated only by moonlight filtering through gnarled branches, was something I could barely comprehend. Twisted and skeletal, its emaciated body dripped with rotting flesh and mud. Hollow eyes burned with a hateful glow as it lifted its grotesque face toward me, blood and gore dripping from its jaws. It wasn't the girl. It was something far worse. Its mouth stretched open, emitting a shrill, bone-chilling scream that echoed violently through the forest. And in that moment, I knew I'd found exactly what had taken her, exactly what was now coming to take me. The creature lunged forward with horrifying speed, its skeletal limbs extending unnaturally as it charged at me. I threw myself to the side, slamming painfully against the rough bark of a tree, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws filled with razor-sharp teeth. Scrambling back to my feet, I felt hot breath on my neck as the creature let out another ghastly, echoing howl. I sprinted blindly deeper into the woods, branches whipping against my face, tearing at my skin. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle an ominous threat. My lungs burned, begging me to stop, but I knew that stopping meant death. Behind me, I heard the creature's hungry growls closing the distance, relentless, driven by some unholy need. Then, just when I was certain my legs would collapse beneath me, I stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller, lit faintly by pale moonlight. My heart froze at the sight in front of me. An old rusted car sat abandoned, its paint peeling, tires deflated. It was decades old, half hidden beneath vines and moss. The driver's door hung open, the interior darkened with bloodstains long dried into the fabric. My breath caught sharply. This was her car, the place where it had all started 20 years ago. Behind me, the growls ceased abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Trembling, I turned to see the girl standing there once again, pale as death, her sunken eyes wide and pleading. Blood seeped steadily from her throat, cascading down her torn, muddy dress. "You found me," she whispered softly, voice filled with unbearable sadness. "Now you know what it is. What it's done. Who or what is it?" I gasped, fighting through fear and exhaustion. "How can I stop it?" Her hollow eyes narrowed slightly, filling with pain. "It feeds on suffering and fear. It took me first, now it's bound here, trapped by my pain. Every victim it claims lets it grow stronger. If you want to stop it, you must destroy the thing that binds us both." "What thing?" I pleaded desperately. "Tell me." Her gaze slowly shifted toward the wrecked car behind me. My stomach tightened, dread pooling within my gut. Slowly, reluctantly, I stepped closer, peering into the vehicle's shadowy interior. My hand trembled as I reached inside, fingers brushing against something cold and metallic on the seat. I lifted the object carefully, feeling a strange heaviness that had nothing to do with weight. It was a blood-stained locket, tarnished and worn. With trembling hands, I clicked it open. Inside was a faded photograph, an image of the girl smiling brightly, captured forever in a moment of youthful innocence, untouched by horror. As I stared at the photo, the girl's voice whispered sorrowfully from behind me. "That was mine, until he took it from me. It carries his sin." I spun around to face her again, questions burning on my lips, but she was gone. In her place stood the twisted, grotesque creature, snarling viciously, its eyes blazing with fury. It advanced slowly, clawed hands digging into the muddy earth, lips peeling back to reveal rows of blood-stained teeth. In a flash of understanding, I knew exactly what she meant. The locket was the anchor, the cursed object, binding the creature to this place, trapping her between life and death. To destroy the monster, I had to destroy the locket. I raised my arm to fling it away, but before I could, a powerful blow struck me from behind, knocking me violently to the ground. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the mud, tasting blood. Dazed, I looked up, vision blurring. Standing above me, illuminated by the eerie moonlight, was the elderly man from the diner, his frail appearance now replaced by something sinister, cruel. In his hand, he clutched a rusted, blood-stained blade. "You shouldn't have interfered," he hissed, eyes glinting with murderous rage. "She belongs to me. She always has." And as the creature howled triumphantly behind him, I realized with gut-wrenching horror that this nightmare was far from over. I stared up into the elderly man's twisted, hate-filled eyes as he raised the rusted blade high above his head, ready to end my life. The monstrous creature lurked behind him, waiting impatiently, its hollow gaze burning into me. My body ached, limbs heavy with exhaustion, yet something inside refused to surrender. "Why?" I choked out, desperate to stall him. "Why did you do this to her?" His lips twisted into a cruel sneer. "She tried to run from me that night, so I stopped her. But she stayed here, haunting me, tormenting me all these years, feeding it. I've spent decades making sure no one freed her." The creature growled hungrily behind him, moving closer, claws tearing eagerly at the mud. But suddenly a faint whisper drifted through the clearing, gentle yet firm. "No more." It was the girl, shimmering faintly at the edge of the clearing. Her presence glowed softly, illuminating her pale face. She stepped forward slowly, calmly, her eyes fixed bravely on the elderly man who'd stolen her life. The man's expression twisted in rage and fear as he turned toward her ghostly form. "You belong to me," he shouted. "No," she replied quietly, defiantly. "I belong to myself." He stumbled backward, startled, dropping the blade into the mud. The creature shrieked angrily, realizing its grip on the girl was weakening. It lunged toward her, claws outstretched, but something incredible happened. The ghostly girl stood her ground, her pale light intensifying as she raised a hand, pointing directly at the locket lying beside me in the mud. "Destroy it," she commanded, her voice strong, fearless. "Free us both." Summoning the last ounce of strength I had left, I grabbed the locket and struggled to my knees. With the creature roaring toward me, teeth bared and the man diving desperately to retrieve his knife, I knew I had only one chance. I slammed the locket against a large, jagged stone, shattering it instantly. A pulse of blinding white light erupted from the shattered locket, filling the clearing. The monster howled in agony as the darkness that had formed it burst into flames, dissolving into ash. The elderly man screamed, clawing desperately at the light as it consumed the evil he'd carried, stripping away his cruelty and leaving him powerless. As the glow faded, silence fell upon the woods. Breathless, I looked up. Standing before me, radiant and at peace, was the girl. Her wounds were gone. Her eyes shone warmly, filled with gratitude. "You freed me," she whispered, smiling gently. "You've given me peace." Behind her stood others, the spirits of all those who had vanished along Route 29, now free and bathed in a comforting, peaceful glow. They nodded to me, their faces full of relief and quiet joy, before gently fading into the soft, rising dawn. Sunlight broke over the treetops, washing away the night's terror. The elderly man now sat trembling on the ground, aged and frail once more, tears streaking down his cheeks as he faced the truth of his actions, no longer protected by the evil he'd hidden behind. I rose slowly, feeling a weight lift from my chest as warmth filled my body. The girl reached out, touching my arm softly. "Thank you," she said, her voice serene. "You've broken the cycle." With a final gentle smile, she slowly faded into the golden morning light, leaving behind only a peaceful silence in the clearing. Route 29 was finally safe, its ghosts laid to rest, their torment over at last, and somehow, against all odds, I'd survived to tell their story. The end.